When people look back at early NES box art, there's a common misconception that it looked plain because it had to. Early graphics were simple, technology was limited, so the boxes were basic, almost by necessity. Black backgrounds, pixel art, very little drama. But here's the interesting part. When Nintendo released the NES in North America in 1985, none of that packaging was accidental. It was carefully chosen to look that way. And understanding why Nintendo made that choice means understanding how video games survived the 1980s. To understand why Nintendo's packaging choices mattered, you first have to understand the market they were stepping into. By the mid-1980s, video games weren't exciting anymore. They were suspicious. Just a few years earlier, store shelves had been flooded with games, most of them rushed and wildly inconsistent in quality. Retailers were stuck with inventory they couldn't sell. Customers felt burned, and the entire North American video game market collapsed almost overnight, which, in hindsight, is impressive, considering video games had only been a mainstream thing for about 5 minutes. By 1985, video games didn't have a marketing problem. They had a credibility problem. So when Nintendo prepared to bring the NES to the United States, they didn't roll it out like a typical tech launch. They tested it, quietly, in New York City. Nintendo treated that first rollout almost like a field experiment, setting up displays by hand, watching how people reacted, and adjusting things as they went. They weren't just paying attention to which games sold, they were watching how people decided whether or not to trust them. Because if the NES failed here, it wouldn't just hurt Nintendo, it would confirm what a lot of people already suspected, that video games were a phase, a fad, and probably not worth giving shelf space to again. And that made every single decision, even something as seemingly small as the way a box looked, matter a lot more than it normally would. One of the reasons video games lost credibility in the early 1980s had nothing to do with hardware. It had to do with expectations. For years, video game boxes promised far more than the games could realistically deliver, which was ambitious considering what the hardware could actually do at the time. Dramatic artwork showed detailed characters, intense action, and cinematic worlds, and then you got the game home and realized your heroic warrior was a square. If you grew up in this era, you probably remember that moment, staring at the screen thinking, okay, this is not what the box made the game look like. And that disconnect added up. Parents felt misled, players felt disappointed, and retailers were left dealing with returns, complaints, and stacks of unsold games they couldn't move. In other words, box art didn't just sell games, it shaped trust. And by the time the NES was preparing to launch, that trust was already damaged. In 1985, there were no trailers, no online reviews, no gameplay videos. The box was the product description. It was the only promise being made at the shelf, and sometimes that promise was doing a lot of heavy lifting. So when someone picked up a game, they weren't just buying a cartridge, they were buying an expectation. And when that expectation wasn't met, it reinforced the exact fear retailers already had. This is just going to happen again. By the time Nintendo entered the US market, packaging wasn't a minor detail, it was a potential liability. This is where Nintendo's early NES games really start to stand out, because if you line them up on a shelf, something becomes obvious almost immediately. They all look exactly the same. Black backgrounds, the same layout, the same overall vibe. It's less creative free-for-all and more, this is a uniform. These early releases are often called Nintendo's black box games, and visually, they were doing the opposite of what most video game packaging was doing at the time. Instead of dramatic paintings or action-packed scenes, the focus was almost always on the game itself. Sprites, screenshots, simple recreations of what you'd actually see on the screen. Which means no heroic poses, no intense facial expressions, and definitely no one attempting to hack the Gibson. In fact, some of these boxes are so restrained that they almost feel like they're saying, let's all just calm down for a second, everyone. And the consistency is impossible to miss. Game after game, the boxes don't try to outdo each other. They don't shout, they don't compete, they just exist together. Which is interesting, Because when companies usually go out of their way to make everything look the same, it's not because they ran out of ideas. It's because they're trying to send a message. So why would Nintendo lean so hard into restraint? Why go with boxes that looked almost underwhelming? The answer is surprisingly practical. Nintendo wasn't trying to make the games feel bigger than they were. They were trying to make sure the game felt exactly as big as advertised. In 1985, the box wasn't just marketing. It was the entire explanation. There were no gameplay trailers to watch, no screenshots online, no reviews to scroll through. If you wanted to know what a game looked like, you had one option. You stood in the store and stared at the box. Years later, people involved in Nintendo's early branding and marketing, including designers like Tim Gervin, have described how much thought went into what customers could immediately see and understand on the box before buying. So instead of using packaging to spark imagination, Nintendo used it to reduce uncertainty. Those screenshots and sprite recreations weren't there to impress you. They were there to answer a very simple question. What am I actually going to see when I turn this on? And suddenly, the plainness makes sense, because if the box shows you exactly what the game looks like, there's no surprise waiting at home. No bait and switch, no awkward moment where you wonder if you bought the wrong game. Just, yep, this is what I expected. Which doesn't sound exciting, but in a market that had just collapsed, it was incredibly reassuring. In other words, Nintendo wasn't trying to win your imagination, they were trying to win your confidence. And once you see it that way, those boring boxes don't look boring at all. They look carefully crafted by a company that understood the game market at the time. Now, it's important to understand this clearly. Nintendo didn't plan to make plain, restrained box art forever. This wasn't a manifesto, it wasn't a rule carved in stone. It was a phase. Once the NES started to gain traction, once retailers felt comfortable stocking games again and players felt confident buying them, the pressure eased. And when the pressure eased, the box art loosened up too. Illustrations came back, styles diversified, publishers started experimenting again. And yes, sometimes that experimentation went a little far. But that's kind of the point. Nintendo could afford to loosen the reins because the groundwork had already been laid. The early restraint had done its job. By then, the NES wasn't a question mark anymore. It was a proven platform. So the boxes didn't need to explain themselves quite as carefully. They could be expressive, dramatic, even a little weird. And that shift is actually a great tell, because when you see consistency disappear, it usually means confidence has taken its place. So when you look back at early NES box art now, it's easy to misread it. It's tempting to see those black boxes and think, well, of course they look plain. That's just how games were back then. But that explanation doesn't really hold up, because this wasn't about what Nintendo could do. It was about what they chose to do. At a moment when video games were trying to recover from a serious credibility problem, Nintendo treated packaging less like decoration and more like infrastructure. Something functional, something dependable, something that didn't promise more than it could deliver. And that choice mattered. It helped retailers feel comfortable putting games back on shelves. It helped parents feel better about buying them. And it helped gamers trust that what they saw on the box would actually show up on the screen. Which isn't flashy, but it is effective. And once that trust was rebuilt, everything else, bigger games, bolder art, more expressive packaging, could follow. So those early NES boxes weren't boring because they lacked imagination. They were boring because imagination wasn't the priority yet. Confidence was. And sometimes the smartest design decisions aren't the loudest ones. They're the honest ones. And honesty is often the boldest move you can make. Looking back, which NES game do you think best matched what the box promised, and which one didn't? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this content, well, you know what to do. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and happy gaming, my friends.